Because of the CBS News special report which follows, Mayberry RFD will not be presented tonight, but will return next week at its regularly scheduled time over most of these stations. The Draft Lottery, a live report on tonight's picking of the birth dates for the draft. Here at Selective Service Headquarters in Washington is CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd.
Good evening. It was 29 years ago that the first and most famous lottery number, 158, was drawn as the United States entered World War II. Tonight, for the first time in 27 years, the United States has again started a draft lottery.
I told myself when I became president in this office, I wanted to do one thing, and that was to advance education among all of my people.
And the famous first pick tonight is September 14th, the first birthday that now is designated 001, which means for 19-year-olds born on September 14th, that beginning in January, local draft boards will induct those men born on September 14th, barring deferments. The next birthday in order, April 24th, and so on down the line this evening.
This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. Some citizens of South Vietnam, at times with understandable grievances, have joined in the attack on their own government. But we must not let this mask the central fact that this is really war.
Number 18 is September 26th, November 1st, June 4th, August 10th, June 26th, July 24th, October 5th, February 19th, December 14th, July 21st, June 5th, March 2nd, March 31st, May 24th, April 1st, March 17th, November 2nd.
Additional forces will be needed later, and they will be sent as requested. This will make it necessary to increase our active fighting forces by raising the monthly draft call from 17,000 over a period of time. Once the communists know, as we know, that a violent solution is impossible, then a peaceful solution is inevitable.
Number 18 is September 26th, November 1st, June 4th, August 10th, June 26th, July 24th, October 5th, February 19th, December 14th, July 21st, June 5th, March 2nd, March 31st, May 24th, April 1st, March 17th, November 2nd.
So here we are, 60 laws later. We can count the laws, but no one can count the lives that these laws have and will change. How many bright youngsters have been discovered and inspired who might otherwise have been ignored? How many families have fulfilled the dream of college for their children? The answers to those questions, I think, explain to you why I feel as I do about education.
In reality, the Vietnam era does not have a beginning. And for those who served in Vietnam and their families, and millions of Americans and Vietnamese, it has no ending. It proves that history is a living force. But historians do like to name periods of time after the dominant events and themes of a particular age. The Vietnam era is defined here as 1963, when President Kennedy sent 16,000 American advisors to South Vietnam. It is, of course, the year he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The Vietnam era ends in 1974 as President Nixon resigns the presidency and President Ford signs a proclamation offering clemency to Vietnam-era draft evaders and military deserters. In the sure measure of the end, the North Vietnamese, in violation of the Paris Peace Treaty, attacked the South Vietnamese, and without the backing of Congress and the American people, America does not re-enter the war in 1974 or thereafter. The Vietnam era has another name, the 60s. Actually, the 60s are often divided into 4 time periods. Funny, they actually do begin in 1960 and travel through 64, transition to 65 to 1967, and explode into 64 and 69, the most turbulent years, and they go through and wind down from 1970 to 1974. The most turbulent time span was 1965 to 1972. The Vietnam War escalated. The civil rights movement boiled over. And there was fire in the streets and mass demonstrations across the country. There were as many as 300,000 of them, men who became teachers during the Vietnam War era. Why did they choose teaching, which had historically been a woman's job, much like nursing or secretarial work? Why did they choose an occupation that didn't pay well, had a relatively low social status, and little opportunity to make more money? Did men really talk about a desire to work with children and adolescents? Did all these guys just want to coach? Did their subject field matter a great deal to them? Subjects like industrial arts, physical education, elementary education, high school math, high school English. There must be more than 20 reasons combined why both men and women became teachers. For men, during the Vietnam War, there was one overarching reason to become a teacher: a draft deferment. A powerful influence allowing a man to avoid the draft and the war with a fair degree of certainty. The evidence is found in the 300,000 teacher deferments given to men during the period. Further empirical evidence are the hundreds of thousands of men who received student deferments from their local school boards as they became teachers. The men were young, mostly white, lower, middle to middle class. 25% were married, 80% taught in high schools or junior high schools. They attended college and earned a college degree in education. In all of American history, with the exception of the Civil War years, the 60s, the Vietnam era was the most revolutionary in terms of social, cultural, political, and economic times of change. It was a tumultuous period of uninterrupted war, both hot and cold war, violence at home, loss of trust in government, and controversial social change. It was a period of revolution, precipitating fear and angst to young and old Americans, rich and poor, men and women, whites and African Americans. No one could escape the era. Certainly not Americans, because for the first time in American history, children and adults watched their armed forces fight a war. They saw the Vietnam War unfold on their televisions, in their living rooms, often with family and friends. The television would by itself change the course of history for everyone living in the 60s. McEwen was absolutely right. The medium was the message. Paradoxically, it was a period of mass moral and humanitarian movements, revolutionary in cultural terms, striking progress for those who had been oppressed throughout American history. African Americans, the poor, and women. And to a lesser extent, people with disabilities. The civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the peace movement, the war on poverty, and even Dear Mother Earth had her own movement, the environmental movement. These were all an outgrowth of the 1960s. Of course, the civil rights movement and the peace movement met with very harsh resistance, including violence throughout the 60s. To be sure, there were radical elements in these movements who were bent on using violence and creating anarchy. They did little but damaged their own cause. The Cultural Revolution of the 60s took many forms, none of which were embraced by a religious, conservative, and very paternalistic society. In 1962, America was a society built on Christian values, patriotism, hard work, civility, the military-industrial complex, and the always elusive American dream. When the 60s popped on the radar screen, introducing radical change, including, for the first time, draft card burning, protest marches, a sexual revolution, the use of drugs recreationally, turning on, tuning out, long hair, hippies, nudity in public, and of course the music of Bob Dylan, the Beatles, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, to just name three. The older generation, the so-called establishment, wow, they exploded in condemnation. They really didn't like the music. Politically, the 60s began with a wonderful spirit of optimism after the election of the charismatic and young John F. Kennedy. It ended with the near impeachment of President Nixon and his resignation over the Watergate scandal. In between, Americans witnessed assassinations, literally on television, a war gone bad, riots in the street, police beating peaceful protesters. Who can forget the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention and Mayor Daley, the television coverage, even roughing up CBS newscaster Dan Rather. This was all on TV. Also, in between President Kennedy and the resignation of President Nixon, the country witnessed college students cut down in the prime of their life. In Ohio, by the National Guardsmen, men the same age or slightly older than the kids they shot to death. America also saw the collapse of the Great Society and the violence and ugliness that accompanied the desegregation of schools. Symptomatic of the times, the radical change stimulated scientific progress and intellectual thought to improve the social and economic conditions of society. All of America cheered and were so proud as the entire world watched the United States land a man, actually two men, on the moon. The Apollo 11 manned mission to the moon was at first envisioned by President Kennedy as America's best answer to the Soviets' launch of Sputnik. The Cold War was on. With the death of President Kennedy, the space-age torch was passed to President Johnson and Nixon. They did their best. Landing men on the moon was one of the boldest achievements in the history of the world. What seems now a nod to the 1960s, the first man on the moon, the first man to walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong, set upon landing and turning off the engine of the Eagle, named after the national bird. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Armstrong named that little place of heaven where he touched down on Tranquility, the much sought after space of the age of Aquarius. How poetic. To understand the experience of the men who became teachers during the Vietnam era and the women who loved them, their mothers, their wives, their girlfriends, their friends, and the women who taught with them, we must recognize the weight of the Vietnam War as it interweaved through the fabric of every political, social, and cultural force of the time. The Vietnam War was devastating to Americans in many ways. And this, my friends, is the untold story of a large and important group of men who did not serve their country in Vietnam, but the majority of which may have very well served their country in the schoolhouse. These were men who did not march off the war. Instead, they shuffled off to college, got a degree, and strolled into a classroom, a familiar classroom. At the same time, Uncle Sam drafted hundreds of thousands of men across the United States to go to Vietnam. These boys were predominantly poor and disproportionately black. During most of the long war, 58,000 men would die in Vietnam. Channeling. One of the major products of the selective service classification process is the channeling of manpower into many endeavors, occupations, and activities that are in the national interest. Thus said General Lewis B. Hershey, longtime director of the Selective Service, in a 1965 document called Channeling, which was reprinted by Ramparts magazine in December of '67, and which touched young Americans everywhere as something must be up, something's wrong. Why is the government engaged in sorting us out? Social engineering. Let me continue with that document, Channeling. While the best known purpose of selective service is to procure manpower for the armed forces, a variety of related processes take place outside delivery of manpower to the active armed forces. Many of these may be put under the heading of channeling manpower. Many young men would not have pursued a higher education if there had not been a program of student deferment. Even though the salary of a teacher has historically been meager, many young men remain in that job, seeking the reward of a deferment. The process of channeling manpower by deferment is entitled to much credit for the large number of graduate students in technical fields, and for the fact that there is not a greater shortage of teachers, engineers, and other scientists working in activities which are essential to the national interest. Yes, General Hershey himself had been a teacher. He went to Tri-State University in northeastern Indiana. It's now called Trine University. Lewis Hershey was proud of being a teacher. He considered his years as a teacher some of his best. He was a lifelong learner. Let me continue with the authors, that is, General Hershey's channeling. The system has also induced needed people to remain in these professions, such as teaching, and in industry engaged in defense activities or in the support of national health, safety, or interest. This was coupled with a growing public recognition that the complexities of future wars would diminish further the distinction between what constitutes military service in uniform and a comparable contribution to the national interest out of uniform. The meaning of the word service, with its former restricted application to the armed services, is certain to become widened much more in the future. This is the paragraph that set the nation on fire. The club of induction has been used to drive out of areas considered to be less important to the areas of greater importance in which deferments were given. The individuals who did not or could not participate in activities which were considered essential to the defense of the nation, the selective service system anticipates further evolution in this area. No group deferments are permitted, but the concept that patriotism is best exemplified by service in uniform has always been under some degree of challenge, but never to the extent that it is today. In today's complicated warfare, when the man in uniform may be suffering far less than the civilians at home, patriotism must be interpreted far more broadly than ever before. This is not a new thought, but it has had new emphasis since the development of nuclear and rocket warfare. Educators, during the last 10 years particularly, teachers, have been convincing the American public that for the mentally qualified man, there is a special order of patriotism other than service in uniform, that for the man having the capacity, dedicated service as a civilian in such fields as engineering and teaching constitute the ultimate in their expression of patriotism. A large segment of the American public has been convinced that this is true. From President Truman in 1950, Dwight Eisenhower in 1956, to John F. Kennedy in 1961, the U.S. committed itself to the creation of a free, non-communist South Vietnam. These presidents were steeped in the traditions of the Cold War. The domino theory. America believed in the global struggle to contain communism. The domino theory warned that a communist North Vietnamese victory over South Vietnam would result in the fall of the rest of Southeast Asia to communist rule. This would include countries Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, and perhaps the Philippines. In 1964, LBJ, President Johnson, ran as a peace candidate, yes, a peace candidate, to defeat the Republican Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. At that time, there were less than 24,000 troops in Vietnam. By July of 1965, Johnson had responded to General Westmoreland's request for more men, and he sent 50,000 infantry troops to Vietnam. LBJ's Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended calling up reserve units in the National Guard to fight the war. That seemed to make sense, but Johnson didn't want any part of it. He did not want to unduly alarm the American public. Instead, he called upon the Selective Service to once again crank up the draft. LBJ announced a doubling of draft calls in July of 1965. The call for draftees went from 16,000 each month to 40,000. Local draft boards sent up 399,000 draftees in 1966. About 300,000 men were drafted during 67, 68, and 69. 900,000 men. In 1965, there were 2,655,000 men in uniform. By mid-68, the total had climbed to 3.5 million. Despite the demands of the Vietnam War for more men, early discharges from military service, and job deferments, such as teacher deferments, from the draft dramatically climbed. Occupational deferments rose from 238,000 on Halloween 1966 to 303,687 on Trick or Treat Night 1967. Occupational deferments soared to 486,000 in 1968. The teacher deferment is one of the occupational deferments. The United Press International in 1968 reported from Washington, D.C. that Selective Service Headquarters spokesmen were unable to say how many of its 2A occupational deferments were for teachers, but said it would be a large percentage. UPI went on to report that draft boards were inclined to look with favor on deferments for teaching. A spokesman explained that a man deferred for study and teaching until he was 26 would be at least certain to escape military service under the present system of call-ups. Based on my research, I conclude that a conservative estimate of the number of men who avoided the draft and becoming teachers at 300,000. This is K through 12, and it does not include the thousands of men who became college professors or teaching assistants during the Vietnam era and who were able to avoid the draft. That's my next project, my next book. America has drafted men, and only men, in every war it has fought, save the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. To my surprise, I discovered that teachers received exemption or deferments from the draft during the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I. Teachers did not receive occupational deferments during World War II. Not many did. Only engineers and a select few scientists were granted deferments in the national interest. But the draft boards loosened up during the Korean conflict. The military needed less men during the Korean conflict, and this resulted in extreme discrimination regarding who served in the military and, once in, where they served. Students and teachers received generous deferments. Again, who was drafted reflected social class differences. Why teachers? Vietnam was a war which did not require the full mobilization of its forces, and this permitted very selective channeling. General Lewis B. Hershey, Director of Selective Service from World War II through most of the Vietnam era, called the 4,000-plus local draft boards little groups of neighbors. How nice. Hershey was a champion of decentralization and believed that community groups of men should sit in judgment of the young men in their community. He thought this was much better than some bureaucrat in Washington or a machine making such important decisions that would affect the future course of a man's life. Local draft boards and the Selective Service became the target of overwhelming criticism during the Vietnam era. First, boards really were not made up of a cross-section of the community. Until 1967, when Congress enacted reforms, draft boards did not reflect at all the pool of men eligible for military service. Veterans accounted for 66% of the members. Almost one-half were over 60 years old. 30% had college degrees at a time when only 12% had college degrees nationwide. African Americans composed only 1.3% of all 16,632 board members. There were no African Americans on any of the boards in Indiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Kansas, or Mississippi, at a time when 12% of the country was African American. Studies have shown that across the country, local draft boards did not make consistent decisions. The most inconsistency in their decision-making was in the area of occupational deferments. Second, the granting of conscientious objector status. And third, granting student deferments. The Selective Service under General Hershey did not issue mandates. Rather, they issued regulations in the form of guidelines for local boards. No wonder there was widespread variation among draft boards nationwide and even in the same locality. What was consistent, though, was the line of discrimination across the country based on social class. The local draft boards had one other peculiar characteristic relevant to our discussion. 26% of the board members were or had been on the local school board. If there was ever an instance when a board member did know a registrant, it would have been when the registrant appearing before the board was a male teacher. And even if the board member didn't know Mr. Holland or Mr. Chips, the first question to a man appearing before the board was always, "Where do you work?" followed by, "Where do you live?" Here's an exchange between board members in 1968. A male teacher appears before the draft board. The draft board members are talking among themselves. Board member 1. "Good Lord, I never saw so many men teaching grade school before," referring to the files in front of him. Board member 2. "Might be the best thing that could happen to the schools." Board member 1. "Yeah, except that we don't want them teaching school just because they want to get out of the Army." Chairman: "Well, I think the schools will weed those out for us. The clerk, the all-important clerk." "We do have this advice from state headquarters, saying it is policy to defer all teachers as critical." Board member 3. "Well, I think, like board member 1, we shouldn't be automatic on the teachers. I'm not that sure about schools weeding them out either. They need bodies. Let's at least be sure that someone like the superintendent of schools puts out some effort to keep them." Next, the clerk talks about others who are trying to get occupational deferments. Clerk: "Well, on these other occupationals, you've been deferring them if they're scientific, but I've had some of the employers who won't even write a letter when asked for their worker." Several members: "Draft them! Hell yes, call them up." Chairman: "Hell, we're fighting a war. If they can't take the time to write a letter, draft them." Clerk: "Okay." And then there's this XYZ company. They won't send a letter describing the man's job. They just send a telegram saying, "Please defer so-and-so. He's vital to our operations and we are in defense work." That's all, nothing else. I've written to them several times and explained that we need more. Chairman, angrily: "Draft them! These companies think they can impress you with a telegram instead of doing their job right? Well, I think it's about time we got tough on all these occupations." Board member 1. "Yeah, but not the teachers." I have located a great deal of evidence that indicates if a draft board did ask for support from a superintendent for a teacher deferment, they certainly got it, and sometimes the superintendents even wrote a letter and set forth the names of all the eligible male teachers. The tragedy of war. During the Vietnam War, up to the time of the lottery, young men faced the draft. It was always hanging over their head, face to face with the draft and the war at an age when vision was hardly fully developed. 18 years old, 22 years old. Over the long course of the war, Selective Service Act did change. We don't have time to get into all those changes here. But throughout the war, the basic options for a young man were as follows: enlist and join the military. That way, you could choose your branch. You could enlist in the reserves or the National Guard if you had connections, if you could pull strings. By enlisting in the reserves or National Guard, you assured yourself you'd never be sent to Vietnam. You had the choice to cooperate with the Social Security system and attempt to get a deferment. This meant going to college, getting a job deferment, or another type of deferment. You could get married. That was a deferment, part of the war. And whether you were married or not, you could become a father. There was the fatherhood deferment. Just as long as you said to Selective Service, even though you weren't married, I'm very much a part of this baby's household. For part of the Vietnam era, you could go to graduate school and get a graduate deferment. One could get a medical or physical deferment, or one could request CO status. But in the rare cases where the local draft board did grant the registrant CO status, they were still obligated to perform some kind of service for 2 years. You could file for the 3A deferment. This was the hardship to a dependent deferment. The dependent being your wife, your child, your younger brother, maybe your parent. These were the options. It was not an easy decision to make for thousands of men who decided to become teachers. Clearly, the evidence shows that thousands of men had no intention of making teaching a career. They were forced through the channeling device of the Selective Service, the government, if you will, to study education, get a license, and teach for the sole or primary reason of avoiding the draft. This was legal, it was legitimate, but was it ethical or moral? Here's an excerpt from a couple of my interviews. Interview 1. No doubt about it, I knew I could get a deferment for teaching. I was not opposed to the war. I don't think I even knew much about it. I was not a radical. I just didn't want to go to war, for me. I'm not ashamed of that, or, well, I wouldn't be talking to you now. You wouldn't even know who I was. For me, teaching wasn't all that bad. It paid the bills. It kept me out of Vietnam. But I got the hell out of teaching as soon as I could when they quit drafting. Actually, I put my name in the first lottery because I knew if I got a low number, I was draftable. I still had my teacher deferment. They still let me have that because I had it before the lottery. But I got a high number, so I was free to do what I wanted. I got into construction, and I did quite well. I became a millionaire. I'm a millionaire, you know. You think I could have done that being a teacher? No. My ex-wife, she's a teacher, and she married another teacher after me. And they do okay. They're retired now. But they gotta watch every penny. I don't. The second interview. Oh man, I don't look back. Part of the reason I became a teacher was to avoid getting drafted. Not the only reason, but I knew I wouldn't have to worry about it. It's hard to say now how much it influenced my decision. I didn't really like teaching, though. I did it for 5 years, and when the draft ended, I quit. I taught social studies and history, but I thought it was monotonous. The same damn classes every day. The same kids with the same zits every day. I taught in a small town and everybody knew everybody. I always felt like I was in a fishbowl. All the kids were pretty good, overall. But they didn't care about history at all. But maybe I wasn't really very good at it. My principal liked me, so I didn't have any problems. He'd gone to high school with my dad. I went into business, and I worked for a large corporation in their human resources division. I liked it. I liked being around adults. And I liked making twice the amount of money. Do I feel bad using teaching to avoid the draft? You know, I've never been asked that before. No, I don't. But on the other hand, I wouldn't brag about it. It just happened. It is what it is, man.